The microphone slipped from Hyunjin's hand the moment Felix walked past him without even a glance. The arena was still filled with noise, thousands of fans cheering, cameras flashing like endless stars. But for Hyunjin, everything suddenly became silent. Just seconds earlier, he had called Felix's name. Felix. Simple word, a familiar voice, the same voice Felix had always turned toward without hesitation. But not this time. Felix kept walking. No smile, no playful shoulder bump, no response, nothing. The audience barely noticed. To them, it looked like an ordinary moment during a crowded event. Yet every member standing on stage felt the shift immediately. A crack, small, invisible, dangerous. Hyunjin stood frozen beneath the bright stage lights while Felix greeted the fans on the opposite side of the stage. For the first time in years, Felix acted as if Hyunjin wasn't there. And it hurt more than Hyunjin expected. Nobody understood why, not the members, not the staff. Not even the fans who had spent years watching their friendship grow. Only Felix knew the truth, and he wished he didn't. The event continued. Songs were performed, speeches were delivered, smiles were forced. Yet an uncomfortable tension lingered beneath every interaction. Hyunjin kept stealing glances toward Felix. Felix never looked back. Every time their eyes almost met, Felix found something else to focus on: the crowd, the cameras, the floor, anything except Hyunjin. After the show ended, the members returned backstage. The hallway smelled faintly of sweat, makeup, and warm stage equipment. Usually, Felix would be the first to joke around after a performance. Tonight, he walked ahead alone. Felix. Hyunjin's voice echoed behind him. Felix stopped for one brief second, then continued walking. The silence that followed felt unbearable. "What's wrong with him?" one member whispered. No one had an answer. Hyunjin stared at Felix's retreating figure. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Fear, not anger, not frustration, fear. Because deep down, Hyunjin knew something had changed, something serious, something that might not be fixed with a simple conversation. Later that night, the dormitory felt unusually quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass like distant memories. Felix sat alone in the living room. A cold cup of tea rested untouched beside him. His phone screen glowed in the darkness. One message remained unread, from Hyunjin. "Can we talk?" Felix closed his eyes. The words felt heavier than they should have, because he wanted to talk more than anything. That was the problem. He remembered 6 months earlier, the beginning of everything, the moment that changed him. At first, it had been harmless. Late-night conversations, shared laughter, comfort during difficult schedules, moments nobody else noticed. Moments that slowly became important, too important. Felix had spent years convincing himself that his feelings were simple. Friendship, trust, brotherhood, nothing more. Until one night shattered that illusion. They had been sitting on the rooftop after practice. The city stretched endlessly beneath them. Hyunjin had been talking about his fears, about pressure, about expectations, about feeling lost. Felix listened quietly. Then Hyunjin smiled, not the smile fans saw, not the smile cameras captured. A different smile, soft, vulnerable, real. And suddenly Felix realized something terrifying. His heart wasn't behaving like a friend's anymore. From that day forward, everything became complicated. Every laugh mattered too much. Every compliment lingered too long. Every moment together felt dangerous. Felix hated himself for it. He hated the confusion, the guilt, the fear. Most of all, he feared losing Hyunjin. Because if the truth ever surfaced, what would happen? Would their friendship survive? Would everything collapse? The uncertainty consumed him. So Felix did what he thought was safest. He created distance. At first, only a little, then more and more, until eventually he found himself ignoring the person he cared about most. The strategy was supposed to protect them both. Instead, it only created pain. Across the dorm, Hyunjin sat awake in his room. His sketchbook lay open on the desk. The unfinished drawing staring back at him looked strangely familiar, because without realizing it, he had drawn Felix again. He sighed and rubbed his eyes. Something wasn't right. For weeks, Felix had been changing, pulling away, avoiding conversations, leaving rooms earlier than usual, laughing less, smiling less. It wasn't normal. And Hyunjin couldn't stop thinking about it. The worst part wasn't knowing why. Questions echoed endlessly inside his mind. Had he said something wrong, done something wrong, failed as a friend? Every possibility felt equally painful. The clock continued ticking. Minutes became hours. Neither of them slept. Both trapped inside different versions of the same loneliness. Morning arrived beneath gray clouds. The members gathered for another busy schedule. Everyone acted normally, or at least tried to. Felix maintained a careful distance. Hyunjin pretended not to notice. But pretending became harder with each passing day. Weeks slipped by. The tension spread through every interaction. Conversations shortened. Silences lengthened. Smiles became rare. Eventually, even the fans noticed subtle changes. Questions began appearing online. Speculation grew. Rumors multiplied. Yet neither Felix nor Hyunjin addressed any of it because neither knew how. Then came the day everything finally broke. It happened during a rehearsal, a small mistake. A missed cue normally insignificant, but emotions had been building for too long. "Can you just tell me what's wrong?" Hyunjin suddenly asked. The room fell silent. Everyone stopped moving. Felix looked up. Their eyes met fully for the first time in weeks. The air felt heavy, almost impossible to breathe. Hyunjin's voice trembled. "I don't care if you're angry." Felix remained silent. "I don't care if I made a mistake." Still silence. "But please stop acting like I don't exist." The words struck harder than Felix expected because they were true, painfully true. He saw exhaustion in Hyunjin's eyes, confusion, hurt, fear, the same emotions he had been carrying himself for months. Felix looked away, then back again, and finally understood something. Distance wasn't protecting anyone. It was destroying both of them. The walls he built had become a prison, not a shield. Slowly, Felix stepped forward. The room remained completely silent, every member watching, every heartbeat loud, every second stretching endlessly. Then Felix spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Nothing more, nothing dramatic, just 2 words. Yet they carried months of regret, months of guilt, months of loneliness. Hyunjin stared at him. The tension in his shoulders slowly eased. Neither of them had all the answers. Neither knew exactly how to repair the damage. But for the first time in a long time, they were facing each other instead of running away. And sometimes healing doesn't begin with explanations. Sometimes it begins with a single moment of honesty, a single apology, a single step forward. Outside the rehearsal room, rain began falling against the windows, soft, steady, gentle, as if the storm that had lived between them for so long was finally beginning to pass. And though neither Felix nor Hyunjin knew what the future would bring, they both understood one thing clearly. The silence had ended. And that was enough to start again. The rain continued long after rehearsal ended. Drops slid down the tall windows, blurring the city beyond into streaks of silver and gold. The members slowly returned to practice, but the atmosphere had changed. Not completely, not enough, yet something had shifted. Felix's apology still echoed in Hyunjin's mind. "I'm sorry." Simple words, 2 words that somehow raised even more questions, because Felix still hadn't explained why, and Hyunjin could see it clearly. There was something Felix wasn't saying, something much deeper hiding beneath the surface. The rehearsal finally ended several hours later. Staff members packed equipment, managers discussed schedules. The members prepared to leave. Felix quietly grabbed his bag and headed toward the exit. "Wait." Hyunjin's voice stopped him. Felix froze. The hallway felt strangely empty. Only the faint hum of air conditioning filled the silence. Hyunjin approached slowly. For a moment neither spoke. They simply stood there, facing each other. The distance between them felt much smaller than before, yet somehow more intimidating. "You still haven't told me the truth." Felix looked down. His fingers tightened around the strap of his bag. "I know. Then tell me." Words weren't demanding, they were gentle, almost pleading. Felix swallowed. The truth sat heavily inside his chest. Every day he had carried it, every day he had hidden it, and every day it became harder to breathe. "I can't." Hyunjin's expression fell. "Why?" Felix searched for an answer, any answer, but none felt safe. Because the real answer terrified him. The real answer could change everything. So instead he looked away. "Because I'm afraid." Honesty surprised even himself. Hyunjin blinked, afraid of what before he could ask. Footsteps echoed through the hallway. Staff members appeared around the corner. The moment vanished. Felix immediately stepped back. "We should go." And just like that, the conversation ended. Again. That night, the dormitory was unusually quiet. Most of the members were exhausted and went to sleep early. The living room remained dark except for the faint glow of the television screen. Hyunjin sat alone on the couch. His thoughts refused to settle, afraid. The word kept repeating inside his head. What could Felix possibly be afraid of? Arguments, misunderstandings, losing friendships? None of it made sense. Felix had always been brave when it mattered. He faced criticism, pressure, exhaustion. He carried responsibilities with a smile. So what was different now? Hyunjin leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Suddenly, he remembered something. A moment from months ago, a small memory he had almost forgotten. They had been filming content late at night. Everyone was tired. The staff had already left. Only a few cameras remained. At one point, Hyunjin had nearly fallen asleep on the couch. When he woke up, Felix had quietly placed a blanket over him. Nothing unusual, except for the expression on Felix's face. It lasted only a second, a fleeting moment. But now, remembering it, something felt different. The look hadn't been ordinary concern. It had been something else, something deeper. Hyunjin sat upright, his heart suddenly beating faster. No, the possibility entered his mind before he could stop it. Then he immediately rejected it. That couldn't be it. Could it? Across the hall, Felix sat on the floor of his bedroom. His phone rested beside him. The room was dark. Only moonlight illuminated the space. A notebook lay open in front of him. Its pages were filled with unfinished thoughts, words he never intended anyone to read, feelings he never planned to confess. His eyes settled on one sentence, a sentence written months ago, a sentence he should have erased. "I wish things were simpler." Felix laughed bitterly. Nothing about this situation was simple anymore. The more he tried to escape his feelings, the stronger they became. And now Hyunjin was getting closer to the truth. That frightened him. Because if Hyunjin understood everything, there would be no turning back. Their friendship might survive, or it might not. The uncertainty was unbearable. Felix closed the notebook and buried his face in his hands. For the first time in months, exhaustion overwhelmed him. Not physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. The kind that settled deep inside the heart. The kind that made every day feel heavier than the last. Meanwhile, Hyunjin couldn't sleep. Near midnight, he quietly left his room and walked toward the kitchen. The dorm was silent. The floor creaked softly beneath his feet. As he passed Felix's bedroom, he noticed a faint light beneath the door, still awake. Without thinking, Hyunjin stopped. His hand hovered near the door. He hesitated. Part of him wanted to walk away, the other part needed answers. Eventually, he knocked, once, twice. Silence followed. Then came Felix's voice. "Come in." Hyunjin slowly opened the door. The room was dimly lit. Felix sat on the floor beside his bed, looking tired, looking vulnerable, looking nothing like the cheerful person everyone expected him to be. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Hyunjin quietly sat down across from him. The atmosphere felt fragile, like glass. One wrong word could shatter everything. Felix stared at the floor. Hyunjin studied his face. For the first time, he noticed details he had overlooked before. The dark circles beneath Felix's eyes, the tension in his jaw. The sadness hidden behind every forced smile. How long had he been carrying this alone? The realization hurt. "You haven't been okay for a while, have you?" Felix remained silent, but silence itself became an answer. Hyunjin looked away. A strange ache spread through his chest, because suddenly this wasn't about himself anymore. It wasn't about being ignored. It wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about Felix suffering alone, and somehow that felt worse. "Wish you had told me." Felix's eyes finally lifted. Their gazes met. The room seemed to shrink around them. "I wanted to." His voice sounded fragile, almost broken. "I didn't know how." Hyunjin's heart tightened. For the first time, he wasn't angry, wasn't confused, wasn't frustrated. He simply felt sad that someone he cared about had been struggling so much. The rain outside continued tapping against the window, soft and steady. Neither moved, neither looked away. And in that quiet room, surrounded by shadows and moonlight, the distance between them began to disappear, not through dramatic confessions or grand gestures, but through understanding. The kind of understanding that comes when two people finally stop pretending they're fine. The kind that begins when someone chooses to stay instead of walking away. For the first time in months, Felix didn't feel completely alone. And for the first time in weeks, Hyunjin felt closer to the truth than ever before.
For a long moment, neither Felix nor Hyunjin spoke. The rain outside softened into a faint whisper against the glass, and the dorm seemed suspended in time. The city lights beyond the window flickered through the darkness, casting shifting shadows across the room. Hyunjin remained seated on the floor. Felix sat opposite him. The silence no longer felt hostile. It felt fragile, careful, as though both of them were standing at the edge of something important, something neither fully understood. Hyunjin glanced at the notebook beside Felix. The cover was worn from use, the corners bent, a habit Felix had always had. Whenever life became overwhelming, he wrote not songs, not messages, thoughts, the ones he couldn't say out loud. Hyunjin noticed Felix subtly move the notebook farther away. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but it revealed more than words could. There were things inside those pages Felix desperately wanted to protect, or perhaps hide. "Have you been sleeping at all?" Hyunjin asked quietly. Felix laughed softly. The sound carried no amusement. Much, can tell, Felix rubbed the back of his neck. His eyes remained lowered. For months he had rehearsed countless conversations in his head, different versions, different outcomes, yet now that Hyunjin was sitting right in front of him, every prepared sentence had vanished. Only fear remained, fear and honesty, both dangerous. Hyunjin studied him carefully. The longer he looked, the more he realized how much Felix had changed recently, not on the surface. The smiles were still there, the jokes still appeared when cameras were rolling, but underneath something had been fading, something had been hurting, and somehow nobody noticed, not even him. The realization filled Hyunjin with guilt. I should have paid more attention. Felix immediately shook his head. No, Hyunjin. Felix finally looked at him directly. The sincerity in his eyes stopped Hyunjin mid-sentence. This isn't your fault. The words hung in the air, simple, honest, yet somehow painful, because they sounded like someone carrying a burden alone for far too long. Hyunjin lowered his gaze. For years, their friendship had felt effortless, natural, like breathing. They understood each other without needing explanations. At least that's what he had believed. Now he wasn't so sure. Perhaps there were entire parts of Felix's heart he had never truly seen. Outside, thunder rolled quietly across the distant sky, the room briefly illuminated with pale flashes of light. For a second, Felix's face looked older, more tired, more vulnerable. Then the darkness returned. Hyunjin leaned back against the side of the bed. You know, he said softly, the day you ignored me on stage. Felix immediately stiffened. The memory still haunted him. I thought I had lost you. Confession caught Felix off guard. Hyunjin continued staring at the floor. I know it sounds dramatic, doesn't? Kept wondering what I did wrong. His voice grew quieter. I replayed every conversation we had. Every word landed heavily. Felix felt his chest tighten, because while Hyunjin had been blaming himself, Felix had been doing exactly the same thing, both suffering, both alone, both convinced they were protecting the other. The irony felt cruel. A bitter smile appeared on Felix's lips. We're idiots. The first time that night, Hyunjin laughed. A genuine laugh, soft, warm. The sound instantly eased some of the tension between them. Felix found himself smiling too. A real smile, not one created for cameras, not one worn out of habit, just a smile, and somehow that felt strange after so many difficult weeks. The conversation continued slowly at first, then more naturally. They talked about schedules, exhaustion, memories from years ago, funny mistakes during training, embarrassing moments neither wanted fans to discover. The room gradually felt lighter. The heaviness that had haunted them for months began to loosen its grip. Hours passed without either noticing. Eventually the rain stopped. The clouds drifted apart. Moonlight spilled through the window. Hyunjin glanced at the clock. It was nearly 3 a.m. No wonder we're always tired, Felix chuckled. Probably. Another comfortable silence settled between them, different from before, not empty, peaceful. The kind shared between people who no longer feel obligated to fill every moment with words. Then Hyunjin spoke again, quietly, carefully. Can I ask you something? Felix nodded. Hyunjin hesitated. His fingers tightened slightly against his sleeve. What exactly were you afraid of? The question immediately changed the atmosphere, not dramatically, just enough for Felix to stop smiling, enough for his heartbeat to quicken. The room suddenly felt smaller, warmer, more dangerous. Because this was the question, the one he had been avoiding for months, the one standing at the center of everything. Felix looked away, moonlight reflected in his eyes. For several seconds he said nothing. Hyunjin didn't pressure him, didn't rush him, he simply waited, patiently, the way he always did when something truly mattered. Felix's throat tightened. The answer existed, clear and undeniable, yet speaking it felt impossible, like stepping off a cliff, like crossing a line he could never uncross. Finally he exhaled slowly, a long, trembling breath. Then he spoke, not the entire truth, not yet, but closer than ever before. I was afraid that if things changed. His voice faltered. Hyunjin listened carefully. I wouldn't know how to go back. Confession lingered between them, neither fully understood its meaning, yet both felt its weight. Hyunjin's expression softened. For some reason, hearing those words made his chest ache, not with sadness, with something else, something harder to name. He wasn't sure why. Felix wasn't sure either. The night continued around them, quiet, still, neither realizing that the walls they had built for months were slowly crumbling away, not through dramatic revelations, not through perfect answers, but through honesty, one conversation at a time. And as dawn slowly approached beyond the window, painting the horizon with the first pale hints of morning, Felix felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope, small, fragile, uncertain, but real. For the first time since everything had begun, he wasn't running away. And perhaps that was the beginning of healing for both of them. The first rays of morning sunlight crept through the curtains, washing the room in pale gold. Neither Felix nor Hyunjin had realized how much time had passed. The city outside was beginning to wake. Cars moved along distant roads. Birds called from somewhere beyond the buildings. A new day had arrived. Yet neither of them felt ready to leave the quiet space they had created during the night. Hyunjin sat with his back against the bed. Felix remained beside him on the floor. The silence between them felt comfortable now, not forced, not painful, comfortable. For months, they had been drifting apart without understanding why now, for the first time. They were finally sitting still long enough to see each other clearly. Hyunjin rubbed his tired eyes and laughed softly. "We are going to regret staying awake." Felix smiled. "Definitely. Manager is going to kill us, probably." That made both of them laugh. The sound filled the room, warm, familiar. For a brief moment, everything felt normal again, almost. Yet underneath the calm, unanswered questions still remained. Neither of them mentioned them, not because they were forgotten, because they weren't ready. As the morning grew brighter, Hyunjin stood. His joints protested immediately. "Okay," he groaned. "I'm officially too old to sit on the floor all night." Felix chuckled, being dramatic. "I learned from the best." That earned another smile, the kind of smile Hyunjin hadn't seen from Felix in a long time, and seeing it made something inside him relax, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Before leaving, Hyunjin paused at the doorway. For a second he looked back. Felix was still sitting beside the bed. The sunlight illuminated his face. For once, he didn't look distant, he didn't look lost. He simply looked tired, human, vulnerable. Hyunjin hesitated, then he said quietly, "I'm glad you talked to me." Felix's expression softened. "So am I." The words lingered in the air, simple, sincere. Hyunjin nodded before finally leaving the room. When the door closed behind him, Felix remained still. The silence returned. But this silence felt different, lighter. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. For months, he had carried everything alone. Now someone knew, not everything, not yet, but enough to make breathing easier, enough to make the future seem less frightening. For the first time in a very long while, he allowed himself to believe things might be okay. Days passed, then a week. Gradually, the atmosphere around them began to change. The members noticed it first. Felix laughed more often. Hyunjin seemed less distracted. Conversations flowed naturally again. The awkward distance that had haunted them slowly disappeared. Nobody knew what had happened, nobody asked. They were simply relieved. The dorm felt brighter, schedules felt easier, even exhausting rehearsals became more bearable. Yet despite the improvements, Felix still carried a secret, the same secret that had started everything, the same truth he had never spoken aloud, and every day that passed made it harder to ignore. Because spending time with Hyunjin again only intensified the feelings he had tried so desperately to bury. One evening, after a particularly long rehearsal, the members gathered in the practice room. Music played quietly from a speaker. Everyone was exhausted. Some stretched, others sat on the floor. A few simply stared into space. Hyunjin sat nearby, sketching absent-mindedly in a notebook. Felix watched him without realizing it, the concentration on Hyunjin's face. The way he tilted his head while drawing, the habit of biting his lip when focused, tiny details, the kind most people overlooked. But Felix noticed all of them, always had, and that terrified him, because no matter how hard he tried, his feelings refused to disappear. Across the room, Hyunjin suddenly looked up. Their eyes met. Felix immediately looked away. Too late. Hyunjin had noticed. A strange feeling stirred inside him, something unfamiliar, not discomfort, not confusion, curiosity. Over the past few weeks, he had begun seeing Felix differently, not because Felix changed, because his own perspective had changed. The distance between them had forced him to confront something he never expected, how important Felix truly was to him. The realization frightened him, not because it was bad, because it was impossible to ignore. That night, while everyone prepared dinner together, Hyunjin found himself watching Felix. The way Felix laughed at a joke. The way he instinctively helped others before helping himself. The way he listened carefully whenever someone spoke. Things he had seen countless times before, yet somehow they felt different now, more significant, more meaningful. Hyunjin couldn't explain it, and that bothered him. As days turned into weeks, those thoughts followed him everywhere, during rehearsals, during interviews, during flights, even during quiet moments before sleep. Felix occupied more space in his mind than he cared to admit. One evening, unable to focus, Hyunjin climbed to the rooftop of their building. The sky above was clear. Stars shimmered faintly between city lights. The cool breeze brushed against his skin. He welcomed it, anything to calm the chaos inside his thoughts. A few minutes later, the rooftop door opened, footsteps approached. Hyunjin didn't need to turn around, he already knew who it was. Felix stopped beside him. Neither spoke immediately. The city stretched endlessly before them. A sea of lights beneath the night sky. Finally, Felix broke the silence. "I had a feeling I'd find you here." Hyunjin smiled faintly. "Was I that predictable?" "A little." They both laughed. Then the quiet returned, not awkward, comfortable, familiar, the kind of silence shared by people who no longer needed constant conversation. The wind carried the scent of rain from somewhere far away. The city hummed below. Hyunjin stared at the horizon. Then asked softly, "Do you ever wonder how different things would have been if we had talked sooner?" Felix froze. The question hit unexpectedly. His heart immediately began beating faster. Slowly, he looked toward Hyunjin. The rooftop lights reflected softly in Hyunjin's eyes. For a moment, neither looked away, and suddenly the distance between them felt much smaller than before, almost non-existent. Felix swallowed. "Yeah." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I think about it all the time." Neither realized it yet, but the truth they had been circling around for months was closer than ever, not as a secret, not as a burden, but as something waiting patiently to be understood. And beneath the endless stars above the city, both of them felt it, the unmistakable sense that their story was changing, quietly, slowly, but undeniably.
The rooftop became their refuge. In the weeks that followed, Felix and Hyunjin found themselves returning there again and again. Sometimes they talked for hours, sometimes they sat in silence. Neither felt the need to force conversations anymore. The distance that had once seemed impossible to cross had disappeared so naturally that neither could pinpoint exactly when it happened. Yet something had changed, something important. The fear that once controlled Felix was beginning to lose its power. And the confusion that had haunted Hyunjin was slowly being replaced by understanding. One evening, after another long day of schedules and rehearsals, they found themselves on the rooftop once more. The city glowed beneath them. Countless lights stretched across the horizon like stars scattered upon the earth. A gentle breeze carried the scent of rain. Neither spoke at first. The silence felt peaceful, the kind of peace earned after surviving a storm. Hyunjin leaned against the railing. Felix stood beside him. For a while they simply watched the city, then Hyunjin smiled softly. "You know," Felix glanced toward him, "when you ignored me that day I was really angry." Felix laughed quietly. "I noticed. I wanted to yell at you." "That too." Hyunjin shook his head, "but mostly I was scared." Smile faded from Felix's face. Hyunjin continued looking at the city. "I thought I was losing someone important." The words settled gently between them. Felix felt his chest tight. For months he had convinced himself that creating distance was the safest choice. Now he understood how wrong he had been. Pain shared in silence only grows heavier. Pain faced together becomes easier to carry. Slowly, Felix looked toward the sky. "I was scared too." Hyunjin turned toward him. Felix smiled faintly. Maybe that's why everything became such a mess. Honesty made both of them laugh, not because it was funny, because it was true. For so long they had been trapped by assumptions, by fears, by things left unsaid. Now those walls were gone, not because every question had been answered, not because life had suddenly become simple, but because they had finally chosen trust over fear. The wind moved softly around them. Far below, the city continued its endless rhythm. Cars moved through illuminated streets. People hurried home. Lights blinked on and off in distant buildings. The world continued forward, and so did they. Hyunjin looked at Felix, really looked at him. Not as the cheerful person everyone expected him to be, not as the image seen through cameras and performances, but as someone who carried worries, fears, hopes, and dreams, someone who had spent months struggling alone, someone deeply important to him. A warm smile appeared on Hyunjin's face. "Glad you didn't keep running." Felix smiled back. "Glad you didn't give up on me." Neither of them realized how much they needed to hear those words until they were spoken. The years behind them were filled with memories. The years ahead remained uncertain, but uncertainty no longer frightened them, because they knew one thing for certain. Whatever challenges waited in the future, they would face them honestly, together as friends who understood each other more deeply than before. The rain finally began to fall. Soft droplets descended from the night sky. Neither rushed to leave. Instead, they remained there beneath the gentle rain, laughing as they hurried toward the rooftop door moments later. The sound echoed into the night, light, genuine, free. And for the first time in a long time, neither carried the weight of silence anymore. The misunderstanding that had once threatened to pull them apart had instead taught them something valuable. The people we care about most are not mind readers. They cannot heal wounds they cannot see. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is speak honestly, even when fear says otherwise. As the rooftop door closed behind them, the city lights continued shining below. The storm had passed, a new chapter had begun, and somewhere between the hurt, the silence, the apology, and the forgiveness, Felix and Hyunjin had found their way back to each other, not because they were perfect, but because they chose to stay. And sometimes choosing to stay is the most powerful form of love and friendship there is. The end.